A childhood betrayed in the land of stars and stripes. I was born Jessica Carter, the only child of a powerful family in the lush suburbs of Connecticut. My father, Richard Carter, was a successful real estate magnate whose name carried weight in every glittering social circle. To the outside world, our mansion was a symbol of the American dream. Grand stone arches, manicured lawns, laughter echoing from lavish parties held under twinkling string lights. But inside, the air was tinged with something colder. When I was 9 years old, my world began to fracture. My mother passed away after a brief illness, leaving my father and me adrift. The house felt cavernous and hollow, as if the heart had been ripped from its walls. The winter after, my father remarried. Olivia was beautiful and sophisticated. Her daughter Madison, a year older than me, and astonishingly poised for a 10-year-old. At first, they seemed like a balm, someone to fill the void, to stitch our broken family together. But almost immediately, subtle shifts crept in. Olivia's words carried a sweetness laced with ice. "Jessica, darling, maybe you don't need to sit at the head of the table. Madison's the guest." After all, Madison would forget to invite me to her sleepovers or accidentally take my favorite books. My father, distracted by work and eager for peace, always chalked it up to childhood squabbles. Loneliness became my constant companion. I learned to tiptoe, careful never to upset the delicate balance that Olivia demanded. At night, tucked beneath plush blankets in my princess-themed bedroom, I'd listen to the distant sound of laughter from the den and feel more adrift than ever. Things grew darker as I entered middle school. Olivia began questioning every small mistake I made, twisting them into signs of disrespect or ingratitude. Madison, who excelled at charming adults, would whisper half-truths into her mother's ear. My once loving home became a house of mirrors, where every reflection distorted my intentions and every smile hid a dagger. Through all of this, I clung to hope that my father would one day see through the facade, that he'd remember late-night cocoa and stories he used to tell me when it was just the two of us. But the more time I spent in that house, the more invisible I became. My childhood in America, beneath all the privilege and beauty, was stained by betrayal. That pain, sharp and silent, never quite let go, but it would later become the very fire that fueled my return. Scars of a wounded adolescence, high school should have been my sanctuary, a place to reinvent myself, to find belonging, to maybe, finally, feel at home. Instead, my teenage years were marked by a kind of underlying sadness I learned to hide behind forced smiles and meticulously pressed uniforms. I was 16, quietly excelling in my classes and pouring all my energy into debate club, the school newspaper, and volunteering at the local library. Code words for escapism, really. My happiest hours were spent away from the Carter house, where every return was shadowed by the growing tension between me and my stepfamily. One spring evening, everything unraveled in a way I could never have anticipated. My stepmother, Olivia, called a family meeting, her lips pressed into a thin, triumphant line. Madison stood beside her, avoiding my eyes. My father's face was clouded with confusion, but Olivia's voice rang clear with accusation. Someone had stolen thousands of dollars from the family's savings account. It didn't take long for their attention to turn on me. Madison held up fabricated evidence, screenshots of wire transfers supposedly made from my computer. My protests were drowned out by Olivia's scornful tirade. "After all we've done for you, Jessica." My heart pounded so hard, it drowned out reason. I begged them to believe me, pleaded for them to check the details, tried to explain how easily accounts could be hacked. Tears streamed down my face as my father stood silent, hands trembling at his sides.
Guilty.
He didn't defend me, didn't question Madison or Olivia. He just looked tired, broken, as if accepting their explanation would be easier than unearthing the real truth. That night, in the pouring rain, Olivia packed my things into garbage bags and left them on the front steps. Madison watched from the window, her expression unreadable. My father didn't come out to say goodbye. I walked away with a backpack, a few crumpled dollars, and a heart that felt emptier than our echoing mansion had ever been. Every step I forced myself to take down that long, winding driveway was heavy with disbelief and bitter shame. I remember the smell of wet grass, the ache in my chest, the gnawing sense of injustice. The betrayal wasn't just in the unfounded accusation, but in the way my own father, my anchor, let me slip away without a word. That was the true wound of my adolescence, not the loss of home, but the knowledge that the people I loved most could turn their backs on me with such cold finality. For months after, I'd dream of my old room, of laughter that only echoed in memory. But the bitterness never fully took root. Instead, it transformed into something else: raw determination. If I couldn't clear my name right away, I would someday. I built invisible armor, day by day, piecing together the girl I wanted to become, resilient, unbreakable, and committed to seeking truth, no matter the cost. Years of self-reliance across America. If my old life had left me adrift, New York City slammed me awake. I arrived clutching a few wrinkled bills, a secondhand duffel bag, and a stubborn refusal to be defeated. I was 16, officially unwanted, completely unprepared, but full of unspent dreams and a steely, furious resolve. My first nights, I slept curled in the corner of a friend's living room, making polite conversation and never overstaying my welcome. I quickly learned how fragile hospitality could be. Every borrowed bed was a reminder that I belonged to no one and nowhere. When I finally found a room on the far edge of Queens, cheap, noisy, and barely big enough for a twin mattress, I felt a strange sort of pride. For the first time in years, I had my own space, even if every siren outside my window seemed to shout that the city was always awake, always indifferent. Surviving meant hustling. I took on every job I could find: washing dishes at sunrise in a Brooklyn bakery, stocking shelves until midnight at a corner market, bagging groceries in exchange for leftovers. For a while, I cleaned office buildings after dark, music blasting in my headphones to drown out exhaustion. Every dollar, no matter how small, went into a jar labeled freedom. But I didn't come to New York just to survive. I came because I needed to build. When my shift ended, I rushed to night classes at a local community college, fueled by vending machine coffee and dreams of making more of myself. Every textbook I finished felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a future nobody could burn down. There were setbacks, lost jobs when businesses closed, landlords demanding more rent, classmates who couldn't believe I had no one to call in an emergency. Sometimes I'd stare at my reflection in a subway window, pale and tired and determined, and wonder if anyone else on the train carried their entire life in a single bag. But New York has a way of teaching you grit. I learned to trust my instincts, how to spot trouble before it noticed me, how to move fast and speak up for myself, how to be both cautious and bold. The city didn't care that I was once a Carter. It cared only that I showed up, day after day, and that I refused to quit. Slowly, stability grew. I found a better job in a small law office as a receptionist, surrounded by dusty case files and lawyers who argued about everything. It was here that my sense of justice, the fierce ache left by my stepfamily's betrayal, finally found a home. After my shift, I'd pore over legal dictionaries, reading until my eyes burned, swept up in the stories of people fighting for fairness. When the office manager suggested I apply to Columbia University, it sounded impossible, but I'd spent my whole life scaling impossible walls. My application felt like a shot in the dark, but each essay was my chance to speak my truth. Not just about heartbreak and loss, but about fighting every single day to earn a life no one could take from me. Somehow, against every odd, I got in. Financial aid and scholarships covered the rest. College wasn't easier than the city, but it offered a new kind of challenge. Surrounded by ambition and promise, I carved out my place, balancing studies and work. I interned at legal clinics, volunteered in community advocacy, and built a network of my own. I learned how to craft arguments that cut through lies, not just for myself, but for anyone else who'd ever been written off or wronged. By the time I crossed the stage at graduation, I was no longer anyone's forgotten stepchild. I had shaped my fate from the ashes. I was self-made, tested, and utterly unwilling to let the shadows of the past dictate my future. I still carried scars. They ran deeper than any outside observer could see, but those scars became a silent badge of honor. I had learned, heartache by heartache, that sometimes the only way out is through, growing stronger. Through adversity. Looking back, my years at Columbia were the foundation. But real growth came in the crucible of adversity that followed. New York City had shaped me into someone resourceful, but the legal world was an entirely new battleground. I was 23 when I joined a prestigious Manhattan law firm, clutching my fresh diploma and an even fresher sense of optimism, perhaps naivety. The first day, I walked into the marble lobby, heart pounding beneath my navy suit. Everyone else seemed to know an unspoken code: which elevator to take, how to greet the partners, how to shrink your voice to just the right decibel in the glass-walled conference rooms. It wasn't enough to be smart or driven. I had to prove every day that I belonged. The work was brutal. 18-hour days, poring over contracts, fielding last-minute emergency calls, writing motions long after everyone else had gone home. There were moments in those first months when I considered quitting, times when my self-doubt gnawed louder than any praise. But adversity didn't just test me, it transformed me. Each hurdle forced me to dig deeper. When co-workers underestimated me, I let my work do the talking. When assigned impossible deadlines, I found systems, secret efficiencies, and the courage to ask questions others withheld. Instead of hiding my past, I wove it into my practice, using every humiliation and setback as fuel for advocacy. My empathy became my tool in client meetings. My tenacity made partners take notice. Outside work, I volunteered for legal aid clinics, listening to those who'd been wronged: immigrants, the wrongly accused, survivors of domestic violence, reminded me why I had chosen this path. Their stories echoed parts of my own. I felt my scars soften into purpose. For the first time since childhood, I realized I could take the pain I carried, the betrayals, the loneliness, and build something meaningful from it. Promotion didn't come quickly, but when it did, it meant everything. Standing in that celebration, surrounded by my colleagues, a glass in hand, and laughter twining through the air, I caught my reflection and barely recognized myself. I had become strong from all the times I'd been tested and refused to fall. I found friendship, real, chosen family, with a few other associates who understood struggle. We celebrated small victories over late-night pizza, laughed at our mistakes, and reminded each other why we had to keep pushing forward. Quietly, I started saving again. Not just money this time, but evidence. I never forgot Olivia and Madison. The old wounds still ached, but now I carried them as proof of my growth. I began to research, uncovering loose threads that hinted at the truth behind my expulsion. No detail was too small, no document too old to investigate. Those efforts, sustained in the background as I built my career, were acts of faith, not only in justice, but in myself. I'd learned beyond doubt. Adversity didn't break me. It revealed the real me. I was flawed, determined, and unafraid to reach back into the darkness to reclaim my story. By my late 20s, I wasn't the broken girl left crying on the steps. I was a partner at my law firm, the youngest in the firm's history. Every courtroom win, every client I helped, every day I woke up in my own apartment. None of it erased the past, but each one proved something essential. Strength isn't the absence of pain, but what you do with it. I would never thank Olivia or Madison for what they did, but in a strange way, their cruelty gave me the keys to become the woman I was always meant to be. And finally, I was ready to return to Connecticut, not as a lost child seeking forgiveness, but as a force to be reckoned with, determined to finish the story on my own terms. The journey to unravel an old injustice. Long before I returned home to face the shadows, the idea of reclaiming my name started as a whisper in the back of my mind. There was never a single defining moment, a cinematic flash of certainty, just the persistent ache of insult, and the conviction that I owed my younger self something more than silence. As a junior attorney in a prestigious Manhattan firm, I woke early and worked late. But at night, I combed old memories, pieced together timelines on yellow notepads, and scoured public records under my desk lamp's meager glow. Reopening that pain wasn't just for revenge. It was to affirm, finally, that the girl left in the rain had always deserved better. The first step was documentation. Years had passed, and physical evidence seemed impossible to retrieve. But law school had taught me persistence, and technology had evolved. I filed public records requests, reached out to old acquaintances, even tracked down long-retired bank employees. What was once a blurry accusation became, bit by painstaking bit, something I could dissect. I learned more than I wanted to about my stepmother's financial habits. Familiar names appeared in digital paper trails that someone, somewhere, had assumed would be forgotten. There were odd transfers, amounts that didn't line up with household expenses, logins from unfamiliar devices, banking hours that coincided with Olivia's errands. Madison was harder to pin down. She had moved to Los Angeles, reinventing herself online as an entrepreneur. Her digital fingerprint was sanitized, but not erased. In a moment of perhaps poetic justice, a casual contact from college, now in cybersecurity, helped me retrieve messages lost in email archives, snippets of conversations between Olivia and Madison, discussing the plan to handle me. Reading those words, the betrayal that had haunted my adolescence crystallized. I had not been paranoid. I had been targeted. But gathering evidence was only the first battle. The court of public opinion was its own minefield. My father was older and ailing by now, living with regrets and little memory. I weighed the cost of exposure, the risk of airing family wounds, of testing the limits of forgiveness and truth. But I also recognized something in myself. I no longer wished to hide. My journey wasn't solely about restitution, but about freeing myself from shame. When my research was as airtight as I could make it, I brought in a private investigator, once the nemesis of my childhood, now an ally. He dug deeper into bank records I couldn't access alone, and interviewed former staff from our Connecticut mansion. One housekeeper, long gone from the toxic orbit of Olivia, remembered odd nights when Madison and her mother counted cash in the study. Even as I cataloged these small confirmations, the emotional toll of this excavation was real. Every detail brought the past surging back, but I clung to the perspective of the attorney I'd become, determined, methodical, unwilling to falter. Eventually, I compiled a portfolio: evidence, correspondence, timelines, and testimonials that I could present to authorities if needed. But there was another choice, harder than court filings: to confront Olivia and Madison directly. Part of me wanted to let the law do the crushing work, but another part, the girl who once wanted simply to be seen and heard, needed to show them what I'd become. I wrote a letter requesting a meeting. My hands trembled as I sealed the envelope. The day we met again, I wore my professional armor, a sharp suit, stacks of evidence at my side, and walked into a conference room near my old home. Olivia appeared, much as I remembered, artfully aged, composed, but her confidence wavered when Madison trailed behind her, eyes flickering uncertainly. I took a deep breath and spoke, not just as a lawyer presenting her case, but as the daughter who'd been banished and denied. I laid out the evidence, piece by piece. For once, neither of them could interrupt or twist the narrative. I watched the color drain from Olivia's face. Madison stared at her hands. I felt neither triumphant nor vengeful, just profoundly free. With my documentation, the path to a legal resolution was clear. Attorneys handled the next steps, filing to restore my reputation, reclaiming misappropriated assets, and ensuring the truth was officially acknowledged. It wasn't about money or even the public spectacle. It was about the catharsis of seeing my story whole and knowing no one could rewrite it again. The real victory was in seeing myself, at last, not as someone to be pitied, but as someone who refused to yield to injustice, who turned ostracism into opportunity and pain into power. If you ask whether justice felt like a celebration, I'll admit there were tears, days of exhaustion, and awkward silences in rooms where apologies could never erase the past. But the younger Jessica, the one exiled in the rain, finally had her answer. Not from anyone else, but from the woman she'd become. That was the only closure I ever needed. My triumphant return. The day I decided to come back to Connecticut, the sky was a patient gray, the kind that made the world feel paused in expectation. I wasn't sure if it was nerves or anticipation that set my heart racing as the train rattled further away from Manhattan. I had changed, grown harder, yes, but also gentler with my own scars. Years had passed since I'd last set foot anywhere near our old estate. But now I was no longer the exiled girl clutching a bag of regrets. I was a lawyer, equal parts steel and yearning, returning not out of necessity, but by choice. I arrived dressed not in nostalgia, but in sharp confidence. A fitted navy suit, heels that clicked with purpose, and hair twisted back so not a strand could betray my composure. In my hand was a portfolio filled with evidence, legal briefings, and a letter of intent that bore no hint of hesitation. I had come armed not only with documentation, but with the conviction that my story, once silenced, would now be told on my own terms. Driving past the familiar suburban lanes, I saw my childhood reflected in flashes. The old maple tree I once tried to climb, the iron gate that always seemed so insurmountable. Pulling into the driveway of our former mansion, my hands trembled only slightly. It struck me how both everything and nothing had changed. The facade was the same, but my perception had shifted irrevocably. Olivia greeted me at the door, her posture rigid, perfectly rehearsed. Beside her stood Madison, no longer a poised child, but a weary woman whose armor, I sensed, had been hastily assembled for this confrontation. Their eyes flickered over me, measured, uncertain. If they expected vulnerability or bitterness, I offered neither. Instead, I looked both of them in the eye, unflinching, my voice calm as I requested a private meeting in the old study. The room still smelled faintly of leather-bound books and cedar. I laid the documents on the desk, each page a testament to years of searching, hurting, healing, and refusing to forget. I explained, clearly and methodically, how the old accusations had never held water. And now, with new digital trails, timelines, banking signatures, and corroborated testimonies, there remained no doubt who had orchestrated my expulsion those many years ago. Olivia tried to protest, her denial brittle, but I was unyielding. Madison broke the silence with a confession, an admission stumbled over, with remorse and exhaustion. Seeing her grasp the gravity of what she had helped set in motion granted me a strange sense of forgiveness. But my return wasn't about vengeance. I stated my terms with unwavering resolve. Public restitution, a formal apology, and restitution of the assets that had been taken from me. The meeting, tense and necessary, ended with their signatures on a mediated settlement. My legal standing restored at last. No anger burned in my chest anymore. There was simply relief, like the gentle exhalation of breath long held in the darkness. Outside, the autumn wind carried away the last vestiges of dread. On the porch, my father, older now, frailer, waited with hesitance, his eyes a silent storm of memory and guilt. I chose compassion, offering him a hand as we talked quietly about the years lost, the time wasted by pride and manipulation. It was not the reunion I'd once dreamed of, but it was honest. My old neighbors and a few former friends, hearing the news, reached out, some with apologies, others with cautious curiosity. I attended lunch at a local cafe, finding myself answering questions about my absences with measured grace, never shifting blame, but refusing to let the past be glossed over. Some welcomed me warmly, while others seemed unsure how to reconcile the girl I was with the woman I'd become. But that discomfort didn't wound me anymore. It only reminded me just how far I'd traveled. For days, I wandered the familiar streets, each corner both a graveyard and a garden for my memories. I stood outside my childhood school, lingered near the abandoned playground, and let myself mourn the small joys lost to betrayal. But beneath the surface of sadness, I felt power steadily returning to my bones. Every shadow of the past sharpened the clarity of who I was now. When I finally left Connecticut again, I did so on my own terms, staring into the rear-view mirror as the estate shrank behind me. All I could see was a landscape no longer haunted, but conquered. I had faced every ghost, demanded recognition for what had been stolen, and reclaimed both justice and peace. My return wasn't just a homecoming. It was the culmination of every lesson hardship had etched into me, that I was worthy of my own story, no matter how anyone else had tried to rewrite it. In the end, power meant freedom, not only from the chains of old injuries, but from the expectations of those who never truly knew me. My triumph was not over others, but over the part of myself that once thought I would always be a victim. With eyes fixed boldly forward, I promised the version of myself, old and new alike, that I would never allow another person to decide my worth again. Justice and freedom. For myself, stepping beyond the courthouse, the autumn sunlight hit me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. The door closed behind me, with a quiet finality. For so long, justice had been only a distant hope, a shimmering idea, rather than an attainable reality. Now, as I stood there in my carefully pressed suit, feeling legal documents heavy in my bag and the weight of my own vindication, I realized that true justice was much deeper than any single verdict. It was a reckoning, both with the world and within myself, that stretched far beyond the boundaries of any courtroom. I paused on the courthouse steps, taking in the world with a fresh sense of clarity. There was a strange stillness in my chest, not a void, but a gentle hush where chaos used to reside. I had spent years fighting for this moment, not just to reclaim what was taken from me, but to redefine who I was, once and for all. I thought about the millions of little injustices people suffer in silence every day, and I realized my fight had never been solely personal. It was a stand for my own dignity, but also for everyone whose pain had ever been dismissed, ignored, or deliberately silenced. My victory wasn't loud. There was no cheering crowd, no parade. Instead, it was contained in the subtle softening of my jaw, the easier way my shoulders settled, the newfound steadiness in my hands. As I made my way down the steps, I could feel decades of self-doubt and shame finally beginning to loosen their grip. I was more than the sum of my wounds. For the first time in maybe forever, I could move through the world without dragging an anchor of past accusations behind me. The weeks that followed were filled with practical matters: the return of assets, the issuing of public apologies, and an outpouring of messages from acquaintances, old and new. Some were congratulatory, others laced with tentative curiosity, a few tinged by guilt for actions or inactions that had contributed to my isolation so many years ago. I accepted each response with measured grace. I didn't blame them, at least not anymore. I'd come to realize that people so often choose the easier narrative, one that demands the least discomfort from themselves. What mattered now was that I had changed the ending of my own story. By day, I returned to work at my firm, my sense of purpose newly refined. With every client who came to me, seeking help in their own battles, I felt an almost sacred responsibility. I listened with deeper empathy, remembering how painful it could be to have one's truth doubted. Law, I saw now, was never just a profession or a weapon. For me, it had always been a rescue boat, a way to pull myself and, perhaps, others to shore after the storm. I felt a quiet pride each time I used the knowledge I'd gained in my own struggle to help someone else unravel a legal knot, reclaim their confidence, or challenge an assumption too long left unchallenged. Sometimes, I visited the old neighborhoods of my childhood, Connecticut's manicured lawns, the wooded playgrounds, streets that once bore witness to my loneliness and exile. Walking those streets as a free woman, as someone vindicated by truth and by the life she'd built, I was struck by how much my perspective had changed. The old mansion, for instance, now looked less imposing, less like a monument to betrayal, and more like the empty shell it had become. On one such evening, I ran into Mrs. Monroe, my childhood neighbor, gray-haired, gentle, whose smile had always been tinged with worry during the years of my disappearance. We spoke at length, trading stories over coffee at the local cafe. She told me how, after I left, the house seemed less alive, how she suspected something was wrong, but felt powerless to intervene. Listening, a part of me grieved for all the adults whose silence, well-intentioned or not, allowed harm to thrive. But the larger part felt gratitude, both for the acknowledgement and for my own perseverance. The past couldn't hurt me anymore, unless I let it. I had done the impossible. I had come home, not broken, but remade, At family gatherings, strained, cautious, but necessary, I faced not just Olivia and Madison, but also relatives who had accepted the official story without question. Standing in rooms thick with unresolved tension, I spoke quietly but firmly about facts, about forgiveness, about boundaries that could never be crossed again. I watched some faces soften and others harden defensively. I didn't expect universal understanding. What I wanted, and finally claimed, was my right to my own memory, my own sense of self. Forgiveness was a different sort of justice, more difficult sometimes than the law. It was one thing to clear my name with evidence. It was another to release the anger I'd held so long against those who betrayed me, or simply believe the worst without asking why. For years, resentment had been a kind of shield, but it was heavy and ultimately stifling. Now, in moments of reflection, I could choose differently. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a gift for them. It was a decision for me, a promise not to let old wounds dictate the quality of my freedom. The ripple effects of justice reached further than I'd expected. Old friends came out of the woodwork, some seeking to apologize, others just wanting to reconnect. I navigated those reunions carefully, my boundaries firm. I realized that my social circle now was shaped less by history and more by choice. And what I cherished most were relationships built on truth and mutual respect, not convenience or shared nostalgia. One afternoon, early in the spring, that followed my vindication, I was invited to speak at a local university. The auditorium was filled with young faces, students who, perhaps, saw their own families and challenges reflected in my story. I stood at the podium, nervous at first, then found my voice steadier than I'd expected. I talked less about legal intricacies and more about stubborn hope, about surviving betrayal, and the dangers of letting others dictate your worth. Their questions were thoughtful, sometimes heartbreaking. One student, eyes brimming with pain she struggled to hide, asked, "How do you know when it's time to stop fighting, to let go?" I answered honestly, "You know when your fight is for something greater than revenge, when it's about reclaiming your place in the world, not just proving a point." I told her that justice was never perfect, that sometimes it resembled patchwork more than a clean slate. But every small act of reclaiming truth can build a stronger foundation than shame and accusation ever could. That moment, standing at the front of a room full of questioners, I felt a kind of freedom no court could grant. I had transformed my experience into something empowering, not just for me, but for others who still stood in the shadows. I walked away from that event with a lighter heart, my sense of purpose keener than ever. The journey had been brutal, but it had taught me compassion, not only for myself, but for anyone enduring injustice, no matter how invisible it might seem at first. My relationship with my father remained complicated, a tangle of regret, affection, and the unspoken sorrow of years lost. Sometimes, we sat together in the quiet of his garden, flowering shrubs and gentle breezes, filling the spaces words could not bridge. In rare moments, he offered a look of apology that said more than any conversation ever could. I accepted the peace we managed to create, even if it wasn't perfect. I understood, now, the ways people bury their pain, protect themselves by turning away, and fail when it matters most. If nothing else, my journey through pain and estrangement had helped me see those weaknesses as human rather than monstrous. That, too, was a kind of freedom, understanding where to place sorrow and when to let it finally rest. Professionally, my career took on a new dimension. Clients sensed the difference in me. I was no longer simply their advocate, but a survivor whose strength came from experience as much as education. Colleagues, once distant, now turned to me for advice on difficult cases because of the empathy I'd forged in adversity. I took special care with those who reminded me of myself. Young, uncertain, perhaps battered by circumstances outside their control. To see them thrive gave my own battle meaning, far beyond any settlement or headline. There were obstacles, of course, moments when whispers resurfaced from distant acquaintances or online strangers, questioning the wisdom of reopening the past. I faced them with the same resilience I'd built from years of hardship. The justice I'd fought for was rooted in reality, not the fleeting approval of others. Each challenge reminded me of the steep cost of silence and the power of persistence. I no longer craved acceptance from people who couldn't see the full truth. My standards had changed. I held myself and those around me to a higher level of honesty and courage than I once thought possible. Whenever I felt that old bitterness flaring, I remembered my promise to the girl I once was, never to surrender my sense of self again. I built rituals of self-care, Sunday hikes, nights spent reading novels in the candlelight, trips to art museums where I could lose myself in other people's stories. Little by little, I reclaimed every part of my identity that had been threatened or attacked. These rituals were acts of resistance, but they were also celebrations of autonomy, of healing, of newfound joy. Justice, I learned, is alive. It breathes through the ways we refuse to be silent, in the boundaries we enforce, in every act of kindness to ourselves and others. Freedom is in the waking each day without shame, without the nagging need to defend ourselves for simply existing. The dissolution of my old pain was not instant, but gradual, like sunlight inching across a cold floor, until finally the room is bright. Of course, I still had scars. Sometimes I'd wake from dreams where I was once more the teenager, desperately trying to convince someone, anyone, of my innocence. But those moments grew infrequent as time passed. My spirit felt less tethered to the narrative others once forced on me. I looked in the mirror and no longer saw the outlines of betrayal, but the features of someone who had earned her place in the world. Precisely because she had endured and persisted, I decided at last to write a memoir, both as catharsis and as a marker for others journeying through darkness. The writing process was arduous, stirring up pain, but also illuminating strength. The act itself was another step toward freedom, forging my past into art and testimony. I received letters from strangers, survivors of their own injustices, thanking me for giving shape to feelings they'd never dared name. Each letter reminded me that my struggle, one inch at a time, had created ripples in places I could never have imagined. In my quietest moments, I forgave myself for the years lost to fear and anger. I understood, finally, that those emotions were once my teachers, not my jailers. Each hardship, every sleepless night and lonely subway ride, had taught me something invaluable: how to love my own imperfect journey, how to rise, wounded but undefeated. My definition of justice expanded. It was no longer just about legal righting of a concrete wrong, but also about spiritual realignment, making peace with the past, finding grace in the present, and moving through life with a certainty that no one could ever take away again. Freedom is never perfect, never finished. Some days it looked like triumph, other days like quiet perseverance. But it always belonged to me.